Welcome to Part 3 in Finding Noah and the Land of Creation, tracing the origins of the biblical name Ararat. Being that the etymology and meaning of the name is unclear in the modern Hebrew language as explained in Part 1, alongside mainstream Bible scholars having their general consensus that the name is the Hebrew word for the region of ancient Urartu. We will continue to venture on our journey in tracing the origins of the ancient Hebrew name, Ararat. Let us begin Part 3 with verse 28 from the book of Jubilees, chapter 5. And the ark went and rested on the top of Lubar, one of the mountains of Ararat. It is said in the book of Jubilees that the angel of presence was instructed by our Creator to go and instruct Moses to write the history from the time of creation to the time when the laws were given on Mount Sinai that preceded the 40-year journey in the wilderness. It is without doubt that there are a series of questions that needs to be asked. So let us begin with these two fundamental questions. By what language the angel of presence had spoken to Moses on Mount Sinai? And more importantly, in what ancient text did Moses proceed to write the instructions given to him on Mount Sinai? Given that the Israelites were speaking the Hebrew tongue inherited from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when they sojourned into Egypt, and being the Hebrew tongue is established as the tongue of creation written in the book of Jubilees, along with today's Christian and Jewish traditions, these testimonies therefore conclude that the angel of presence spoke to Moses in the ancient Hebrew tongue on Mount Sinai, and not any other foreign tongue that dispersed out of Babel. Therefore, establishing that Moses wrote the book of Jubilees in the ancient Hebrew text. However, by further studying the history of languages and ancient text prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls, a lingering question of, is the ancient Hebrew text of the Dead Sea Scrolls that of the same ancient Hebrew text written by Moses? Although this would clearly indicate that no other language would have been permitted or perhaps even considered by our Creator to the angel of presence instructed to speak to Moses regarding his sacred text written on Mount Sinai, what remains an absolute question is whether or not the ancient Hebrew text during the Second Temple period is that of the same in the time of Moses. By analyzing the book of Ezra, it is clear that when the Israelites went back to rebuild the temple, they were heavily influenced by the Aramaic ancient language and writings, as it was the lingua franca of the time. Rest assured, by leaving no stone unturned, this journey will lead us to the true ancient Hebrew writings that was first written by the first prophet of our Creator, Enoch. Moving on, hand in hand to Mount Sinai, prior to the Tower of Babel, the one and only language that was being spoken that came out of God's ark was the sacred tongue of creation, the ancient Hebrew. In any case, according to the Bible, of all the languages that existed coming out of the Tower of Babel, none of them were that of the ancient Hebrew until Abraham, and only Abraham, received it again from the angel of presence 6 generations from the days when the earth was divided. The Hebrew tongue of creation that was given back to Abraham, descending through the bloodline of Peleg, and taught to Moses by his father before fleeing Mizraim. Take a minute to understand that after 1,639 years, the tongue of our Creator, who spoke all things into existence and conversed with Adam and Eve in the beginning in the ancient Hebrew, has now been taken away from all the people at the Tower of Babel, replacing the one language of creation with multiple languages that sparked the confusion and dispersion of the nations. For another 3 centuries, the tongue of creation was banned from all peoples who dispersed out of Babel and all their descendants until Abram received it again over 300 years after the dispersion of the nations. Under the stars of heaven, at the age of 75 years in the land of Haran, Abraham, who was called Abram at the time, received in divine knowledge the tongue of creation. This can only conclude that for 74 years, Abraham may have not known that the language of the ancient Hebrew even existed, let alone created. And although Abraham's father and his father's fathers carried the transcriptions of the holy ancient books, Not a single soul of their time were able to understand the sacred text until Abraham, At this time I will kindly note, Peleg's brother Yoktan, with his 13 sons and descendants, were not present at the Tower of Babel. And this significant claim will be proven in the coming series that will lead to the origins of the name Ararat, finding the land of creation and the Garden of Eden. Because not being at the Tower of Babel during the time of its dispersion could only mean one thing: the Hebrew tongue of creation was not taken from you. In the ancient customs and traditions of the first people, the actions that took place at the Tower of Babel would have best been described as being banned from the sacred tongue, or a severe fine, because they challenged the Most High God by wanting to make a name for themselves without divine authority. A punishment that cost them their ability to speak in the tongue of their creation, the tongue of the ancient Hebrew being the language the angel of presence spoke to Moses when instructing him to write the history from creation. And the days of the patriarchs can be established for 2 simple reasons. 1. The ancient Hebrew language is the sacred tongue created and spoken by our Creator when He spoke all things into being, or put simply, into existence. And 2, although the canonical Bible, apart from the book of Jubilees, does not mention the Hebrew language begins at creation, it is well established that the Torah was written in the ancient Hebrew text, therefore concluding that the book of Jubilees was also first written in the ancient Hebrew text. And not only does the book of Jubilees state that the tongue of creation is that of the Hebrew, it is the only ancient text stating it was written on Mount Sinai. However challenged, we can affirm that the name Ararat, instructed by the angel of presence to Moses to write, was a word of the ancient Hebrew language describing a mountain range and then a land region in the latter days of Noah. Thus, as the waters receded back into the earth, it became known as the land of Ararat. And never could it be ancient Urartu of modern-day Armenia and East Turkey. But the ancient Hebrew name Ararat is that of the region known as the Himalayas today. This region is the only place on earth that best fits the biblical description of both the book of Jubilees and the book of Genesis of where the ark of our Creator went to rest. By no means would Moses rename the ancient word Urartu to Ararat, for one simple reason: the angel of presence would not have used a foreign word to describe a place that Noah named in the holy tongue of creation, and more precisely, ancient Urartu, or the modern-day region of Mount Ararat of East Turkey, is simply not the resting grounds for the ark Noah built. And if we are to interpret ancient names, then the ancient name of Bharata, meaning the country of modern-day India, certainly qualifies as the land of Ararat, as it is a part of the Himalayas that carries the meaning in Nepali. The ancient term Bharatavarsha, meaning India, had a more expansive definition, covering the landmass from the Himalayas to the Indian Ocean. This was the territory, or part of the portion, that was handed to Elam as his lot. Elam, the firstborn of Shem. His portion went as far as reaching the boundaries of the river Hikadel. That is the river Tigris and Euphrates together, located in modern-day Iraq. Yes, you did hear me correctly use the word together. To further disprove that ancient Urartu is that of the biblical Ararat, the geographical location of ancient Urartu would have made it impossible for the ark to survive the descending raging floodwaters as it receded back into the earth. We must understand one very vital aspect of the descending floodwaters that covered the whole earth. It carved out the Grand Canyon of North America amongst many other great canyons around the globe. This fact will be explained in detail in future series. However, to conclude that God's ark rested on any other mountain but the highest mountain on earth, as it was written and described by the holy books, is to say that the writings of Moses is a lie, therefore accusing our Creator as the source of the lie. This would also make the false assumption that our history book of creation, book of Genesis and Jubilees, is inconsistent, because it clearly describes that when the ark rested on one of the mountains of Ararat, All the other mountains were still covered by water. In all of Earth's history from creation, only one mountain, and I do mean only one mountain, fits that description. Today, that mountain is called Everest. That aside, if there was ever a certainty of the modern-day Hebrew language, it is the fact that it is not the ancient Hebrew of Moses' time, and most certainly not during the days of Noah and prior. The oldest form known today of the ancient Hebrew text that was used in earlier biblical times is known as the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet, that began with its pictographs representing letters, phrases, and meanings. But where does the ancient Paleo-Hebrew pictographs originate from? Does the ancient pictographs of the Paleo-Hebrew branch out from an older ancient pictograph text? Does it pre-tell an intriguing part of the origins of the name Ararat? So we must ask, does the name Ararat derive from a much deeper meaning that is linked to the time of the flood? What did Noah experience before the flood? And what about during and after the great flood? What gave Noah a reason to name a mountain range and a land region Ararat? What did Noah see? What did he feel, and what did he say to give birth to a name that reaches back in time to almost 5,000 years? Another important question we can ask ourselves is, did someone inspire the name Ararat to Noah? By linking the following acts written in the beginning of the book of Jubilees with the book of Jubilees states that Moses wrote it. It states that the angel of presence instructed Moses to write it. It states that our Creator instructed the angel of presence to instruct Moses to write it on Mount Sinai. And finally, the book of Jubilees states that the tongue of creation is no other than the ancient Hebrew language. Therefore, if Noah did name the region where the ark rested Ararat, and Noah was indeed speaking the only tongue he amongst everyone else knew at the time, being the original ancient Hebrew, what actions or situation did he experience to contrive the ancient word that has a deep and significant meaning, linking us to our past, that will point us in the right direction of the land of creation? Was Noah directed by our Creator himself, thus bringing the origins of the name Ararat to be established the same way many biblical words came to be during the sojourns of the patriarchs? In the history of languages, we can all agree that all languages change over time. However, from the first words between Adam and Eve speaking to our Creator in the Garden of Eden, to the naming of the Ararat Mountains on Mount Lubar, reaching right up to the day the nations dispersed out from the Tower of Babel, according to the Bible, only one language was spoken on earth. We can observe this in the book of Jubilees in chapter 8, verses 2 and 3. It describes the son of Arpachshad, whose name is Kainam, who was able to read the teachings of the Watchers, the fallen angels of heaven, verses 2 and 3, and the son grew, and his father taught him writing, and he went to seek for himself a place where he might seize for himself a city. And he found a writing which former generations had carved on the rock, and he read what was thereon, and he transcribed it and sinned owing to it. For it contained the teaching of the Watchers, in accordance with which they used to observe the omens of the sun and moon and stars in all the signs of heaven. The actions of Kainam tells the reader that he, Kainam, learned writing, and in return was able to read a writing carved on a rock. Therefore concluding that the writing on the rock from former generations in the time of the Watchers were speaking and writing in the original ancient Hebrew, as that was the only language that Kainam could have learned from his father Arpachshad. But as we analyze the days during the rebuilding of the Second Temple period, when the Aramaic language was the common tongue up to the period of our Creator's visitation, Jesus, when the lingua franca was the Greek language, a fair question to ask is, did the ancient Hebrew text of Moses' time change significantly between the time period from when the Ten Commandments were written, along with the Book of Jubilees, to the time of our visitation? Furthermore, how much more significant changes occurred between Jesus' time and the modern-day Hebrew we hear today? We will find the answers as we continue on this journey, But we must begin with a simple question if we are to achieve our goal of tracing the origins of the name Ararat. And that is what word, words, or even a phrase gave birth to the name Ararat at the time of the flood that Noah spoke out of his very lips. To answer this question, we must consider these important facts about the ancient Hebrew language, otherwise known today as the Paleo-Hebrew, that originates from 1. Ancient pictographic text. 2. The ancient text have a numeric system called Hebrew numerals, otherwise known as gematria. 3. The ancient text is symbolic that travels back in time to the very beginning of creation. 4. Hebrew words often come from root words that deepen their meaning and connect them to other concepts in Scripture. 5. The ancient Hebrew tongue spoken of by Adam to Noah and then from Abraham to Jacob to Moses is not the modern-day Hebrew you hear today, nor was it the ancient Hebrew in the time of Ezra. In other words, if one was to go back in time to the days of Adam to Noah coming from the time of the Second Temple and the latter, with exception to the high priests of the time and others who survived the Babylon exile, and was to speak in their form of Hebrew, no one of the ancient world before the flood would understand the language they call Hebrew today. Convincingly enough to say that the modern Hebrew language of today would be considered one of the confounding tongues that came out of the Tower of Babel. Taking these 5 factors into account, we can now begin to trace the origins of the name Ararat. Understanding the name Ararat is solely based around the time of Noah, with its origins linked to where the ark rested and the events that took place during the time of Noah's days. We must therefore be discerning when taking into account all the biblical, lingual, scientific, and above all, the archaeological evidence that only proves one thing above all else. We have a creator who is the master designer, and his word is true. By tracing the origins of the name Ararat, we can most certainly trace where Noah and his family came from, in return leading us to where it all began, the land of creation and the Garden of Eden. Join me in part 4, where we will begin our search with our first link in tracing the origins of the ancient Hebrew name Ararat.